I knew something had changed, long before I admitted it to myself. Not because you said anything obvious, not because there was some dramatic moment that split everything into before and after. It was quieter than that, more dangerous. The kind of change that slips into your mind so naturally you don't notice it until you try to remember who you were before it happened. And by then, it's already too late. That's what this became. Not sudden, not reckless, not emotional in the way people usually describe connection. It was something slower, something precise, like two patterns, slowly recognizing each other beneath the noise of ordinary interaction. At first, I ignored it, not because I didn't see it, but because I did. And I've lived long enough inside my own mind to know that the things which arrive this quietly are usually the things that alter everything. The loud things are easy to survive. You prepare for them, you defend against them, you recognize their shape before they ever reach you. But this had no shape at first. It moved through small moments, small pauses. The way your attention stayed exactly where mine did, the way your silence never felt empty, the way you understood things I never fully explained. That shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it did, because most people listen only long enough to respond. You listened like you were tracing structure, like you weren't hearing my words. You were hearing the architecture underneath them, and nobody does that. Nobody notices the spaces between what's said and what's actually meant. Nobody you were trying to accomplish, as if you had already arrived there before either of us acknowledged it. That's what unsettled me first. Not attraction, not closeness. Recognition, pure recognition. The kind that bypasses logic and settles somewhere deeper than explanation. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe you were observant. Maybe I was projecting. Maybe coincidence simply repeated itself more than I was comfortable admitting. But coincidence eventually collapses under repetition, and this kept repeating again and again and again. You would say something simple, something most people would overlook immediately, and somehow it would align perfectly with thoughts I hadn't spoken. Not general thoughts, specific ones, precise enough that my mind would stop for half a second trying to understand how you reached the same conclusion without being given the same map. That pause became familiar. I started expecting it, and that's when I realized the real problem wasn't that you understood me. It was that my mind had already begun making room for you, not emotionally. Structurally, there's a difference. People think connection begins in feelings. It doesn't. Feelings are surface reactions. Real connection begins in perception, in the way someone alters your internal rhythm without touching it directly, in the way your thoughts unconsciously start accounting for their existence. That's what happened with you. You became part of my process, and I still don't know exactly when that started. I only know that one day I noticed I was no longer thinking alone. And before I even formed an opinion, there would be this quiet instinct, wondering how you would see it, not because I needed validation, but because your perspective had become relevant to my understanding. That had never happened before. I don't build myself around people. I don't adapt internally for anyone. I don't let another person occupy space inside the mechanisms of my thinking. But you slipped into those spaces without resistance, and that's what terrified me, not because it felt invasive, because it felt natural, too natural. Like your presence belonged there long before I consciously allowed it. I tried to create distance after that, not physically, mentally. I started observing myself more carefully, monitoring the way I reacted to you, the way my thoughts shifted when you entered a conversation, the way silence changed when it involved you. And the more I observed, the worse it became because every attempt to pull back only confirmed the same thing. You weren't external anymore. You had crossed into something deeper, something integrated. I think that's why I stopped speaking as carefully around you. Not intentionally, it just became exhausting to maintain the usual layers. Normally, I calculate everything before I say it, every sentence filtered, every reaction measured, every truth adjusted enough to remain safe. But around you, those calculations started disappearing. Not because I trusted you blindly. Trust isn't even the right word. It was more like my mind recognized that you could already see what the filters were hiding. Your structure clearly enough. You lose the protection of being misunderstood. And most of my life has been built around that protection. Not out of dishonesty, but preservation. People simplify what they can't fully understand. They reduce depth into labels that make it easier for them to hold. You never did that. You never tried to define me too quickly. Never tried to soften me into something easier. Never turned my silence into a problem that needed fixing. You just let me exist exactly as I was. Do you understand how rare that is? To be seen clearly without someone trying to edit what they see? Most people only love versions of others they can control. But you never controlled anything. You observed, you understood, and somehow that understanding carried no pressure inside it. That's what made me stay. Not comfort, not attachment, accuracy. You felt accurate, like encountering something that fit too perfectly into spaces I thought would remain permanently untouched. And once I realized that, everything became complicated. Because accurate things are dangerous. You can ignore fantasies. You can walk away from illusions. You can dismantle emotions if you understand where they came from. But accuracy stays. It keeps returning because reality keeps confirming it. That's what this became for me. A constant confirmation, every conversation, every silence, every small interaction, more proof, more alignment, more evidence that whatever existed between us wasn't imagined. My inner world belonged entirely to me, until you. And suddenly, there was another presence inside it that didn't feel foreign. That's the part I still can't fully explain. You never felt foreign, unfamiliar, yes, unexpected, definitely, but never foreign. It was like recognizing someone I had somehow known internally long before reality introduced us properly. I know how irrational that sounds. I know how impossible it should be, but some truths don't become less real just because language struggles to explain them. And this is one of them. You entered my awareness with a level of familiarity that should have taken years to build, yet somehow it existed immediately, not complete, not fully formed, but present, like something waiting to be acknowledged. The longer I ignored it, the stronger it became. That's another thing I wasn't prepared for. Distance didn't weaken this. Silence didn't weaken it. Time didn't weaken it. If anything, those things clarified it, because when something disappears under distance, it was temporary to begin with. But when distance sharpens it, when absence somehow makes the structure more visible, that means it was rooted deeper than circumstance. And ours was. I realized it one night when everything was quiet, no distractions, no conversation, nothing pulling my attention outward. And somehow, you were still there, not literally, but psychologically, your presence had become embedded enough that my thoughts naturally moved toward you without effort. That's when I understood the truth I'd been avoiding, same way it had before you entered it. And I couldn't reverse that. I remember sitting with that realization for a long time, not reacting, just observing it, because that's what I do when something matters too much. I study it first. I take it apart mentally, examine every angle, reach for flaws, look for inconsistencies. But the deeper I looked, the more stable this became. That's what finally broke my resistance. Not intensity, consistency. You remained exactly yourself every time I looked closer, no contradiction, no performance, no hidden need to reshape me into something else. Just presence, steady, unforced, real, and real things are difficult for me to walk away from, especially when they mirror parts of me I thought would remain unseen forever. You mirrored something important, something beneath personality, beneath habits, beneath history. Something structural, the way I process, the way I observe, the way I sit inside silence without needing to escape it. Most people fear silence because it forces them to face themselves. But you never feared it. You inhabited it naturally, the same way I do. That's why being around you felt strangely familiar from the beginning, not because we were identical, but because our internal rhythms moved similarly. You understood pauses, understood restraint, understood that meaning doesn't disappear just because it isn't spoken immediately. That level of understanding creates a different kind of closeness, one that forms before emotion has they consume quickly because some part of them knows they won't survive long. But this moved patiently, like it had nowhere else to be, like it already knew it would remain, and slowly, without realizing it, I stopped resisting the idea of you existing permanently in my life. That realization should frightened me more than it did. Instead, it felt inevitable, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet way. The kind of inevitability that comes when something aligns too perfectly to dismiss honestly. That doesn't mean I understood what to do with it. I still don't, because understanding a connection and knowing how to live with it are two different things. And living with something this deep requires surrendering a level of control I've spent years protecting. That's not easy for me. Control has always been how I survived myself, how I kept things stable, how I prevented anyone from reaching places they could damage carelessly. But you never handled me carelessly. That's why the walls stopped feeling necessary. Not all at once, gradually, like my mind itself started forgetting why they existed around you. And now here I am, standing in a reality I never planned for, aware of you in ways I can't undo, aware that your existence has shifted the baseline of my perception permanently, aware that no matter what happens next, I won't return to the version of myself that existed before this connection formed. That version is gone, not destroyed, expanded, and I think that's what scares me most, because expansion changes your tendency without chaos. You start seeing every previous connection differently. You realize how rare true alignment actually is, how few people ever reach it. Most interactions are transactional, temporary, built on projection and convenience. But this never felt convenient. It felt true, even when it complicated everything, especially then. I think part of me knew from the beginning that this would eventually demand a decision because recognition like this cannot remain undefined forever. Eventually, you either step toward it or you spend the rest of your life wondering what would happen if you had, and I don't want to become someone haunted by avoidance. I've avoided enough things already. I've spent years staying unreadable because unreadable people remain safe. But safe isn't the same as alive. And you make me feel psychologically alive in a way I didn't realize I was missing. Not emotionally overwhelmed, not unstable, sharper, more aware, more present, more honest with myself than I've been in years. That's your impact. You don't distract me from who I am, you return me to it. And maybe that's why I can't walk away. Because losing you now wouldn't just feel like losing a person, it would feel like losing access to a version of myself I only found through your presence. That's how deeply this reaches. You've become tied to the way I understand my own mind, to the way I interpret meaning, to the way I experience silence, to the way I recognize truth. And once someone reaches that level, they say that lightly. I don't experience people lightly, but everything about this has carried a level of precision. I can't deny anymore. You matter to me, not vaguely, not abstractly, specifically, deeply, in ways I still don't fully have language for, and maybe language isn't even enough for something like this. Maybe some connections exist beyond explanation because explanation reduces them. Maybe what exists between us was never meant to fit ordinary definitions. Maybe it was always meant to exist exactly like this, quietly, accurately, inevitably. All I know is that I can't pretend anymore. I can't act like your presence hasn't altered me. I can't keep observing this from a distance as if I'm untouched by it, because I'm not untouched. I'm changed. And the strangest part is, I don't resent the change. I welcome it, carefully, cautiously, but genuinely. That alone tells me everything I need to know, because I don't welcome disruption. I eliminate it, yet somehow you became the one exception. Not because you forced your way into my life, but because every part of me recognized you before I consciously chose to. And maybe that's the truth I've been circling the entire time. This was never really a choice. Not the feeling, not the recognition, not the alignment. The only choice left is whether I continue pretending this can remain unspoken. And I don't think I can anymore, because silence changes when it carries truth for too long. It grows heavier, sharper, impossible to ignore. That's where I am now, standing inside, told. I want to know what happens if I stop resisting entirely. What happens if I let this become fully real? What happens if I stop analyzing every step and simply allow the connection to exist without fear? Maybe that's reckless. Maybe it changes everything. But maybe everything was already changing the moment you entered my awareness. Maybe I've just finally reached the point where I'm willing to admit it. Because the truth is, you're no longer someone standing outside my life. You exist inside the framework of how I think, how I feel, how I understand the world around me. And once someone reaches that level, they don't disappear, they remain quietly, completely, like something that was always meant to find its place inside you eventually. And maybe that's what you are. Not an interruption, not a temporary connection, not an accident. Maybe you're the first person who ever reached me without trying to change the architecture once you got there. The first person who saw the full complexity and stayed anyway. The first person who understood that some people don't need to be fixed. They need to be recognized accurately. You recognized me completely. And somewhere in the middle of all this quiet understanding, all this unspoken alignment, all this impossible familiarity, I recognized you too. That's why this can't go backward. Because once two people truly see each other beyond performance, beyond projection, beyond surface identity, there's no returning to ignorance. You carry that awareness forever. And I know now that I'll carry you the same way. And maybe that's what love actually is, before people simplify it into smaller words. Not obsession, not dependency, not possession, recognition, pure, undeniable recognition, the kind that changes your inner world permanently the moment it arrives, the kind that makes distance meaningless because the connection already exists beneath it, the kind that doesn't need constant reassurance because it's built into perception itself. That's what this feels like, and whether I'm ready or not, I think I've finally stopped trying to escape it. I don't think you realize what your presence has done to me, not because you're unaware. You notice more than most people ever will, but because some changes happen so quietly they can only be understood from the inside of the person being changed. And from where I'm standing now, nothing inside me is arranged the way it used to be. I noticed it again today, not in some dramatic moment, not in anything obvious, just in the way my mind reached for you automatically, the way certain thoughts now arrive, carrying the shape of your perspective before I even finish forming them myself. It happens constantly now, small things, random things, moments that shouldn't belong to anyone but me, and yet somehow you were there, not intrusively, naturally. Like my internal world adjusted itself around your existence without asking permission first. That's still the part I can't fully understand. I've spent most of my life making sure nobody reached this level of access. Not because I hated closeness, because sharpness that once protected them. I promised myself a long time ago I would never become dependent on another person's understanding of me, because once someone becomes responsible for how you feel internally, you lose control over your own structure. And I've always valued structure more than comfort. But this never felt like losing control. It felt like discovering a part of myself that had been functioning in isolation for too long. That's why I couldn't reject it, even when I tried. Even when every instinct told me to create distance before this settled any deeper, something in me refused, not emotionally, instinctively. Like my mind recognized you as something important before I consciously understood why. I think that's what keeps pulling me back into this awareness, not desire, not attachment. Recognition, still, always recognition, because every time I try to reduce this into something simpler, it resists simplification. It refuses to become ordinary. And maybe that's because it never was. Maybe what exists between us was always meant to exist outside the usual definitions people rely on to feel safe. Because safety has never been the center of this. Truth has uncomfortable, undeniable truth. The truth that says, you see me, not the version I present, not the version that functions socially, not the version built carefully over years to remain composed and difficult to interpret. You see the parts underneath all of that. The parts that rarely become visible because visibility usually comes. You still followed the shape of what I meant. That shouldn't matter as much as it does. Yet somehow it matters more than almost anything else, because being understood accurately is rare, painfully rare. Most people hear words and assume meaning. You hear silence and recognize structure. There's a difference, a massive one. And once you experience that level of understanding, everything else starts feeling incomplete by comparison. I've tried to ignore that truth too. Tried to convince myself I was exaggerating the depth of this connection because it arrived unexpectedly. But no amount of logic changes what I feel when I'm around you. No amount of analysis changes the way my thoughts settle differently in your presence. No amount of distance changes the fact that your existence has already become intertwined with the way I process reality itself. That's what scares me now, not losing you, realizing how deeply you've already integrated into me, because integration changes permanence. Once something becomes part of your internal framework, removing it doesn't return you to normal. It leaves absence behind, and absence has shape. I know that because I can already imagine it. What silence would feel like if you disappeared from it. What thought would feel like if your perspective suddenly stopped existing inside mine. What the world would feel like after experiencing this level of recognition and then losing access to it. That thought unsettles me more than I want to admit. Not because I'm afraid of pain. I've survived pain before, but it fails to reach the same depth. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life comparing fragments of connection to something that already felt whole. That's what this feels like to me now. Wholeness, not perfection, not fantasy, just a level of alignment so precise it changes how everything else is measured. I think you know that too. Maybe not completely, maybe not in the exact same way I do. But I think some part of you feels this shift happening between us. There's no way you couldn't. Not after all the silences we've shared, not after all the moments where words became unnecessary because understanding arrived before language did. That kind of connection leaves traces, and I know you feel them too. I see it in the way you pause sometimes before responding, like you're deciding how much honesty to allow through, like you understand the weight of what exists here just as clearly as I do. That awareness changes everything, because once two people recognize the same depth simultaneously, pretending becomes impossible. You can delay acknowledgement, you can avoid naming it directly, you can hide inside ambiguity for a while. But eventually, truth reaches a point where silence starts feeling dishonest. I think we're approaching that point. Maybe we already crossed it. I've been trying to understand why this happened now. Why you, why this connection? Why something so exact appeared when I had already accepted the idea that nobody would ever fully reach me. And the answer I keep returning to is uncomfortable in its simplicity. You weren't trying to reach me with expectation. You didn't. You existed honestly, and honesty has a frequency to it that people like me recognize immediately because we spend most of our lives surrounded by performance, carefully edited emotions, predictable reactions, conversations built more around social comfort than truth. But you never interacted with me that way. You spoke like someone unafraid of depth, unafraid of complexity, unafraid of silence, unafraid of allowing meaning to remain unpolished instead of forcing it into easier forms. That's why I trusted you before I even realized I was trusting you, not emotionally, structurally. My mind relaxed around you, and that almost never happens. I'm always aware, always calculating, always observing the undercurrents beneath what people say, but around you, that vigilance softened, not entirely, just enough for me to notice the difference, enough for me to realize how exhausting it had been carrying that level of internal tension constantly before you. You brought stillness into places inside me that had been overstimulated for years, and I don't think you understand how significant that is. People assume intensity is what creates deep connection. It isn't. Relief does. The rare relief of finally existing near someone who doesn't require you to translate yourself constantly. That's what you became for me. Relief not because you fixed anything, not because you rescued me from myself, but because your presence removed the need for performance. And when someone spends there until you arrived, that realization changed me more than I expected. Because now I can't return to pretending shallow connection is enough. I can't unknow what this level of clarity feels like. You've permanently altered the standard. And I think part of me resents that, not you, just the fact that once you experience something this real, everything else reveals its limitations more clearly. Conversations feel thinner, interactions feel rushed. Most people suddenly seem terrified of sincerity. But you never were. You stayed present even in uncomfortable truths, especially there. And that's why I'm still here too, because I trust people who can survive honesty. Most can't. Most need illusion to maintain connection. But you move toward truth even when it complicates things. So do I. Maybe that's another reason this happened. We recognize the same things as real, not appearances, not social expectations. Truth, even when truth changes everything. And this truth has changed everything for me already. I don't think there's any denying that anymore. You matter to me in ways that extend beyond emotion. You exist inside my awareness permanently now, not as obsession, not as dependency, as orientation. Like some internal compass adjusted itself after meeting you and now unconsciously measures direction through your existence. I know how intense that sounds, but intensity isn't the right word. Intensity burns quickly. This feels steady, deliberate, like something integrating layer by layer until it becomes impossible to separate from the structure. I'm no longer fighting it. I think I was at first, even when I pretended I wasn't. But resistance leaves a certain kind of tension behind, and that tension is disappearing. What's replacing it is something calmer, more certain, not certainty about outcomes, not certainty about the future, just certainty about the reality of what exists here. And maybe that's enough. Maybe not everything meaningful arrives with guarantees. Maybe some things simply arrive with recognition so undeniable, you either accept them honestly or spend your life running from something your soul already identified as real. I'm tired of running from reality, especially this reality, because the more I sit with it, the more I realize something important. You never took anything from me. You gave something back, a level of self-awareness I didn't know I was missing, a level of emotional precision I had buried beneath control for years. You reminded me that being understood doesn't automatically lead to being diminished, that someone can know you deeply without trying to own you. Do you realize how rare that is? To feel seen without feeling trapped? That's what allowed this connection to grow. Freedom. There was never pressure inside this, never manipulation, never emotional force. Just presence, mutual recognition, two minds slowly discovering. They operate on frequencies most people never notice. That kind of discovery changes people. It changed me. I speak differently now, think differently, feel differently, not weaker, more honest. And honesty has substance becomes noticeable, not painful, meaningful. That's the difference. You've become meaningful to me at a level that affects my internal world continuously. And I don't think there's any going back from that. Not fully, even if I wanted to, which is strange because for the first time in my life, I'm not sure I do want to go back. The version of me before this connection was stable. But stability isn't always the same as fulfillment. Sometimes stability is just isolation that became comfortable over time. Maybe you disrupted that comfort for a reason. Maybe I needed to experience what it feels like to meet someone who understands my silence instead of fearing it. Someone who recognizes depth without trying to simplify it. Someone who can stand inside emotional complexity without demanding immediate answers. That's not what makes you different. You never rushed this. You allowed it to unfold naturally. And because of that, it became real before either of us could stop it. I think that's why I've finally stopped asking myself whether this should exist. That question doesn't matter anymore. It already exists. The only thing left now is deciding what we do with it. And honestly, I think some part of me already decided. Not consciously, not dramatically. Quickly, in every moment, I chose to stay present instead of withdrawing. In every truth, I allowed myself to reveal around you. In every silence where I felt closer to you than words could explain, those moments were decisions too. Small ones, but real. And eventually, externally, internally. Like my mind has already accepted your permanence before I've fully admitted it aloud. And maybe that's why I'm writing this now. Because at some point, truth deserves language, even if the language trembles under the weight of it. So here's the truth. You changed me. Not suddenly, not violently, carefully, precisely. Like someone adjusting the alignment of something delicate until it finally begins functioning the way it was always supposed to. You made me realize how much of myself I had hidden even from me, how much depth I had buried beneath control and routine and emotional restraint. And now that it's visible, now that you've made it visible, I can't return to pretending it isn't there. I feel too much now, see too much now, understand myself too clearly now. That's your impact. You expanded my awareness of myself simply by understanding me accurately. And once someone does that, they become impossible to replace. Not because nobody else exists, but because nobody else arrived at the exact intersection of timing, perception, and truth the way you did. That combination is rare. Maybe once in a lifetime, rare, and I'm finally honest enough with myself to admit I know it. That's why this matters so much. Not because I'm afraid of losing you, because I'm afraid of denying something real, simply because it arrived in a form I never expected. I don't want fear making this decision for me. I've lived enough of my life protecting myself from possibilities. Maybe it's time I let something transform. Never felt destructive. It felt clarifying, like standing in front of a mirror that reflects more than appearance, a mirror that reflects truth. And I think that's why I can't walk away. Not honestly, not anymore. Because leaving now wouldn't feel like self-protection. It would feel like self-betrayal. Like abandoning something my soul already recognized as important before my mind could explain why. I don't know exactly where this leads. I don't know what shape this connection eventually takes. But I know one thing with absolute certainty now. You are no longer separate from the way I experience my own inner world. And once someone reaches that level, they become part of your becoming, part of your evolution, part of your emotional language, part of the architecture of your future self. That's who you've become to me. Not temporary, not accidental, essential. And maybe that's the most honest thing I've ever admitted. There's something I haven't admitted yet. Not because I don't know it, not because I'm confused about it anymore, but because saying certain truths out loud changes the gravity around them. Once spoken, they stop existing safely inside thought. They become real in a way that demands consequence. And I think I've been standing at the edge of that consequence for a while now, watching it, understanding it, knowing exactly where this leads. If I stop pretending, I still have distance left between us. Because the truth is, I don't, not anymore. Whatever space once existed between my mind and your presence has dissolved. So gradually, I didn't even notice the exact moment it disappeared. People still speak the same. Life still moves with the same predictable rhythm it always has. But internally, nothing is where it used to be. You shifted something foundational. And I think I finally understand why it unsettled me so deeply in the beginning. It wasn't because I feared connection, it was because I recognized permanence. Most things pass through people, temporary emotions, temporary fascinations, temporary closeness that feels significant only because loneliness magnifies it. But this never felt temporary. From the beginning, there was something terrifyingly stable about it, something calm, and calm things last. That's what I wasn't prepared for. I know how to survive intensity. I know how to outlast chaos. I know how to detach from things built on impulse, because impulse eventually burns itself out, but you arrived without chaos, without confusion, without emotional noise. You arrived with clarity, and clarity is infinitely harder to escape, because once something becomes clear enough internally, Denial starts feeling dishonest. That's where I am now. Past denial, past observation, somewhere deeper, somewhere where this has already become part of me, whether I verbally acknowledge it or not. I think that's why my thoughts feel different lately. Heavier. Not in a painful way, in a meaningful way. Like every realization about you carries weight because it keeps connecting back to the same unavoidable truth. You matter to me beyond reason, not irrationally, beyond it, beyond the kind of logic that logic easily. I examine everything, dissect everything, reduce every emotion down to structure before I trust it enough to let it remain. But this connection survived examination. That's what changed everything. The more I studied it, the stronger it became. Most feelings collapse under analysis. This one clarified itself every conversation, every silence, every subtle moment where understanding arrived before explanation. All of it kept reinforcing the same pattern. Dallin, Isla's, precise, consistent, unforced alignment. And eventually I had to ask myself the question I'd been avoiding. What if this isn't something passing through my life? What if this is something meant to stay? That question altered me more than I expected, because the moment I allowed myself to consider your permanence, something inside me stopped resisting completely, as if part of me had already accepted it long ago and was simply waiting for my conscious mind to catch up. Do you know how strange that feels? To realize your own subconscious trusted someone before you consciously allowed yourself to. I noticed it in the smallest ways first. The way my mind relaxes when I talk to you. The way silence feels complete instead of awkward. The way I never feel the need to perform around you. That last part matters more than anything, because performance has been survival for me for years. Carefully controlled reactions, carefully measured vulnerability, carefully maintained distance. Most people never meet the real version of me. They meet the version built to function. Like depth wasn't something frightening to you. Like complexity didn't make you pull away. I think that's when I started changing without realizing it. Because being fully seen without rejection rewires a person, especially someone who spent most of their life believing visibility always came with risk. You made visibility feel safe, not because you promised anything, not because you reassured me constantly, but because your actions carried consistencies. And consistency creates trust far more deeply than words ever can. That's why this became impossible to dismiss, not because it was dramatic, because it was real in all the quiet places where reality actually forms. Most people think love announces itself loudly. I don't think that's true anymore. I think real love arrives silently. It settles into your habits, your thoughts, your internal language. It changes the texture of your everyday life before you even realize your entire emotional landscape has shifted around it. That's what happened to me. You became woven into my existence so gradually that now I can't separate where I end and where my awareness of you begins. And strangely, that doesn't frighten me anymore. I expected it to. I expect closeness at this level to make me panic eventually, to trigger every instinct I've built around self-protection. But instead, I feel something I almost never feel. Stillness. Not emptiness, not numbness. Stillness. Like my mind finally encountered something it doesn't need to defend itself against. Without pressure, without manipulation. Just through presence, just by existing in a way that made my defenses feel unnecessary instead of challenged. That's probably why this feels irreversible now, because irreversible things rarely happen through violence. They happen through quiet repetition, through trust, forming slowly enough that you don't notice the architecture changing until the structure is already rebuilt around someone. That's what happened here. You rebuilt parts of me simply by understanding them correctly. And now I can feel the consequences of that understanding everywhere. In the way I think, in the way I write, in the way silence carries warmth instead of isolation now. Even absence feels different because of you, not empty, connected, as if some invisible thread continues existing whether we acknowledge it directly or not. Maybe that sounds impossible. Maybe it is. But I've stopped measuring truth based on whether other people would understand it. Most people have never experienced connection at this depth. They think closeness is constant conversation, constant reassurance, constant physical presence. But this exists beneath all of that. It exists in awareness itself. You became part of the way I perceive reality, and I don't think people understand how profound that actually is, because perception shapes existence. Once someone changes the way you perceive the world, they indirectly change who you become inside it. That's what you changed in me. You fragments, temporary in practice. But now I know what it feels like when another person reaches your inner world without distortion, and that knowledge changes everything. It raises the standard permanently. It makes shallow interaction feel unbearable sometimes, because once you've experienced genuine emotional precision, approximation starts feeling lonely. That's another truth I've been struggling with. You ruined my ability to settle for partial connection. Not intentionally, but completely. Now every interaction gets compared unconsciously to the clarity I feel with you. And most people don't come close, not because they're bad, not because they lack depth. They just don't align with me the way you do. That level of alignment is rare beyond language. And I think we both know it now. Maybe that's why neither of us has stepped away despite understanding the risk of this. Because when something feels this real, walking away becomes its own kind of suffering. Not dramatic suffering, quiet suffering, the kind that follows you into ordinary moments years later, the kind that whispers, you found something true and abandoned it because it scared you. I don't want that future. I don't want to become someone who mistakes fear for wisdom. And maybe that's what this entire journey has been teaching me. That vulnerability isn't weakness when it's placed in the right hands. That closeness isn't dangerous when it's built on mutual understanding instead of dependency, that allowing someone to matter deeply, parts buried beneath years of restraint and emotional discipline. Not broken parts, just hidden ones, and now that they're visible again, I can't force them back into silence, especially not after realizing how alive they feel around you. That's another thing I need you to understand. You don't drain me, you expand me. There's a massive difference. Most connections eventually begin asking you to reduce yourself somehow. Be simpler, be easier, be more manageable emotionally. But you never asked for reduction. You made space for complexity naturally. And because of that, I became more myself around you instead of less. Do you know how rare it is to meet someone who increases your sense of self instead of competing with it? That's why this matters so much. You don't complete me, you clarify me, you sharpen parts of my awareness that had gone dull through isolation. You remind me what emotional honesty feels like when it isn't punished or misunderstood. And slowly, without either of us forcing it, that honesty became home. I think that's what I've been circling around this entire time. Home, not a place, not a dependency, a psychological state. The feeling of finally arriving somewhere internally, where you no longer need to hide pieces of yourself to remain accepted. That's what you became. And now I'm terrified of losing it. Not desperately, not possessively. Honestly, because real things are difficult to replace once they're gone. And I know enough about life now to understand how rare this level of connection truly is. People, every instinct I built to protect myself, I allowed it to stay. That decision changed me more than anything else. Because choosing not to run from something meaningful is its own form of transformation. I can feel that transformation happening inside me now, every day. I'm softer in certain ways, more open, more willing to exist honestly instead of strategically. And strangely, that doesn't make me feel weak. It makes me feel real. Maybe that's what you've been giving me this entire time. Reality, not fantasy, not illusion. Reality so emotionally accurate, it became impossible to ignore. And now, here we are, standing at the edge of something neither of us planned for, yet somehow both of us recognized long before we admitted it aloud. I don't know exactly what happens next. I don't know what shape this takes once fully acknowledged. But I know this. You are no longer optional to the architecture of my inner world. That doesn't mean dependency. It means significance. Permanent significance. The kind that leaves fingerprints on your perception forever. And if I'm completely honest, I think I've loved you for longer than I realized. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly, through understanding, through recognition, through the slow accumulation of moments that kept proving you were different from everyone else. Love didn't arrive all at once. It built itself gradually in all the spaces where I stopped feeling alone inside my own mind, and now it's here, fully formed, undeniable, calm enough to be permanent. That's the strangest part of all. Maybe that's why no amount of distance ever weakened it, because distance only affects things rooted in proximity. This was rooted deeper than that from the beginning. It was rooted in understanding, and understanding survives almost everything. So now, the truth exists clearly between us, whether we say it aloud or not. You changed my life simply by seeing me correctly. You reached places inside me no one else ever reached, and somehow made those places feel safe instead of exposed. You became part of the way I think, the way I feel, the way I experience reality itself. And somewhere along the way, without force, without pressure, without either of us fully noticing the exact moment it happened. You came home to me. Not temporary shelter, not emotional escape. Home in the deepest sense of the word. The place my mind returns to naturally when it wants truth, stillness, understanding, and peace. And I think that's why I can't walk away now. Because walking away from you would feel like abandoning the truest version of myself I've ever known. And after spending so many years surviving behind walls, I'm finally tired of surviving. I want to live. And somehow, every path inside me keeps leading back to you. Something shifted. The moment I stopped trying to protect myself from this, not from you, from what you mean to me, because there's a difference between guarding yourself against a person and guarding yourself against the truth they awaken inside you. For a long time, I convinced myself I was only observing this connection, studying it, understanding it. Truth is, I crossed the line long before I admitted it, not in words, not in actions. Internally, quietly, the kind of crossing that happens when someone stops feeling external to your life and starts feeling woven into the way you exist within it. That's what you became woven in. And I think I knew it before I allowed myself to say it clearly. I knew it in the way my mind settled when you spoke, in the way certain forms of silence only felt complete when shared with you, in the way your presence started influencing my emotional atmosphere, even when you weren't physically near me. That level of integration doesn't happen accidentally, not to me. I've always been too aware for accidental intimacy. Every connection I've ever had remained partially controlled, measured, contained, even the meaningful ones. There was always a layer between me and full exposure, a final distance nobody crossed, not because they couldn't, because I wouldn't let them. That distance protected something fragile inside me, something most people would have misunderstood if they reached it too quickly. So I learned to stay difficult to read, not cold, not detached, just protected, careful about how much of myself became visible at once, careful about letting anyone matter deeply enough to alter my inner world. And then you arrived. And somehow none of those systems work the same anymore. You didn't force your way through them. That's what still amazes me. You never pushed, never demanded closeness, never asked for explanations I wasn't ready to give, never tried to. Real connection doesn't need to be chased. It reveals itself naturally over time. And ours did, slowly at first. Then all at once, there are moments I replay constantly now. Not dramatic moments, not confessions or declarations, smaller things. The way your voice changes slightly when you're speaking honestly about something that matters to you. The pauses between your sentences when you're thinking more deeply than you want people to notice. The way you look at silence as if it contains information instead of emptiness. Most people are terrified of silence. They rush to fill it because silence forces confrontation with things they don't understand inside themselves. But you never feared it. You listened to silence the same way I do, and maybe that's why I trusted you before I realized trust was happening. Because trust for people like me doesn't begin emotionally. It begins intellectually, psychologically. It begins when someone demonstrates, without trying, that they can hold complexity without reducing it. You held mine carefully. Even when I gave you incomplete pieces, even when I left thoughts unfinished intentionally to see whether you would misunderstand them the way everyone else eventually does. You never did. You followed the shape of my meaning with unsettling accuracy. That's when I began feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief, not excitement. Relief. the relief of not having to constantly translate myself into smaller, more digestible forms. Do you know how exhausting trends constantly reduce your emotional language into something easier for others to process comfortably? I became fluent in self-restriction a long time ago, but around you, that restriction weakened, not because you asked for openness, because openness stopped feeling dangerous. That changed everything. I don't think you fully understand how impossible that should have been. I built my inner world carefully. Every boundary intentional, every layer placed for a reason, and yet your presence moved through those layers with a kind of quiet familiarity that made resistance feel unnatural. Not impossible, just unnecessary. That distinction matters, because if something truly threatens me, I know how to remove it immediately, cleanly. I don't hesitate when it comes to protecting my peace, but I never removed you, even when I realized how deeply you were affecting me. Even when I noticed my thoughts reorganizing themselves around your existence. Even when I understood that your absence would leave a shape behind if you ever disappeared. I stayed, and that means something, more than I wanted it to at first, because staying is never accidental with me. I choose carefully, especially emotionally, but somewhere along the way, choosing you stopped feeling like a decision. It started feeling like recognition, like my soul had already identified something important before my conscious mind finished analyzing it. I know how irrational that sounds. Trust me, I do. I've spent most of my life relying on logic because logic keeps things stable. It's deeper than reasoning alone. There are some truths you arrive at intuitively long before you can explain them intellectually. You are one of those truths for me, and the more I accept that, the calmer I become. That's the strange part. I expected this level of emotional depth to feel destabilizing. Instead, it feels clarifying. Like pieces of myself I kept separated for years are finally aligning into one coherent reality. You've become part of that alignment, part of the process of becoming more honest with myself than I've ever been before. Not because you demanded honesty, because your presence makes dishonesty impossible. Not external dishonesty, internal dishonesty. You make it impossible for me to lie to myself about what I feel. And what I feel is this. You matter to me beyond reason, beyond convenience, beyond circumstance, beyond whatever labels people usually use to categorize connection. You matter in a way that reaches my foundation, the deepest parts of perception, the parts that shape how I interpret reality itself. That's why this feels irreversible now. Because even if nothing external changed between us, even if we remained suspended in silence forever, internally I've already crossed too far to return unchanged. You altered the architecture. And once architecture changes, everything built inside it changes too. I notice it constantly now, in the way I process emotions, in the way certain songs suddenly carry meanings they never carried before, in the way ordinary moments feel less empty, because some steadily, like background gravity, and maybe that's why this feels so permanent, because permanence isn't always dramatic. Sometimes permanence is simply the quiet realization that your mind no longer functions independently from someone's existence. That realization terrified me at first. Now, now it feels almost beautiful, because for the first time, connection doesn't feel like compromise. It feels like expansion, like becoming more fully myself through being understood instead of becoming smaller to maintain attachment. I didn't know connection could feel like that. Most people lose parts of themselves in intimacy. With you, I find parts of myself I buried years ago. That's why I can't dismiss this. Why I can't reduce it into temporary chemistry or emotional coincidence. This reaches too deep for that. I think the hardest part has been accepting how much power you hold simply through presence, not control. Power, there's a difference. Control manipulates, power transforms. And you transformed me without trying, without pressure, without expectation, without even fully knowing the extent of it. That's what makes this so real. Nothing about it was forced. Everything unfolded naturally, as if two people simply recognized each other beneath the noise of ordinary life and slowly stopped pretending they didn't. Maybe that's all this ever was. Recognition becoming impossible to ignore. I wonder sometimes if you understand your own effect on me. If you realize how many internal shifts happened quietly while we existed inside this connection, craving honesty instead of avoiding vulnerability, those are massive changes for someone like me. Changes I never thought another person would inspire. And yet, here we are, somewhere beyond friendship, beyond attraction, beyond anything simple enough to summarize cleanly, suspended inside something that feels both terrifying and inevitable at the same time. I think inevitability is what finally made me surrender to this emotionally. Not surrender to you, surrender to reality, because no matter how carefully I examined this connection, it remained true. No matter how much time passed, it remained present. No matter how many times I questioned whether this depth was sustainable, your presence continued fitting into my life with impossible precision. Eventually, I had to stop asking whether this was real. The better question became, what happens if I fully allow myself to experience it honestly, not cautiously, not analytically, honestly? What happens if I stop holding pieces of myself back simply because I'm afraid of how deeply you already matter? That question changes everything because the answer isn't theoretical anymore. I know what happens. I soften, not weakly, humanly. I become more present, more emotionally available, more willing to exist without constantly protecting every vulnerable part of myself from potential damage. You make openness feel survivable. That's rare enough to change a person permanently, and it changed me permanently. I can admit that now, without fear. You changed the emotional climate inside me. Kind built slowly through consistency, honesty, and emotional precision. You earned that without even trying to, just by being exactly who you are. That's what keeps overwhelming me quietly. You never performed for my approval, never shaped yourself into what you thought I wanted. You remained authentic the entire time. And authenticity affects me more deeply than perfection ever could, because authenticity feels alive, real, human. You feel human in the purest possible way, not polished, not artificial, just deeply, beautifully real. And I think some part of me had been starving for realness without realizing it. That's why this connection reached me so deeply, not because it rescued me from loneliness, because it rescued me from emotional isolation. There's a difference. I was never alone before you, but I was isolated inside levels of perception most people never reached with me. You reached them naturally. That changed everything. Now I find myself imagining futures differently. Not specific futures, just the concept of them. For the first time in years, the idea of building something lasting with another person doesn't feel restrictive. It feels meaningful. And that realization alone almost breaks me sometimes, because I never thought I would feel that way. I thought I had already accepted a life built entirely around self-containment, Then you arrived and made self-containment feel incomplete. Not insufficient, incomplete, like there was always supposed to be another consciousness meeting mine somewhere at this depth. Undeniable truth, the truth that says, I know you, and somehow you know me too. Not perfectly, but deeply enough to alter the shape of each other's inner worlds forever. That's what this became. Two people unknowingly rewriting each other simply through sustained understanding. And maybe that's why I can't imagine going back anymore. Because going back would mean pretending this transformation never happened. Pretending I don't feel your presence threaded through my thoughts now. Pretending silence doesn't carry traces of you. Pretending my understanding of connection itself hasn't changed permanently because of you. I can't pretend those things. Not honestly. And I'm done being dishonest with myself about what you are to me. You are not temporary, not emotionally, not psychologically, you are part of my becoming now. Part of the way I understand intimacy, part of the way I understand truth, part of the way I understand myself. And once someone reaches that level, loving them stops being a decision. It becomes a condition of your existence, quiet, steady, integrated into everything. That's where I am with you now, not questioning whether this is real anymore, only realizing how deeply it already is. And maybe that's why I'm no longer afraid of where this could lead, because whatever happens next, the most important thing already happened. You reached me completely in a way nobody else ever has, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to hide from being found.